My mother often asked, "Who knows best, the one who travels most, or the one who studies much?" I believe we know the right answer to that now. By traveling, we discover more about man's culture, arts, and belief systems. My own observation of man's belief systems is by no means an attack on anyone's religious faith, for I am not in opposition to the ideals of creationists, although I have different opinions. However, man's mostly fear-based myths and dreams throughout the ages have led the way to beliefs and religious ideals, which continuously reflect his conflicts about good and evil, truth and falsehood, happiness and sadness. Man considered that these aspects of the human being had to be dependent on an unknowable decision-maker, completely divorced from his own mind, thus giving the founders of self-made beliefs authority to control the minds of the masses. Experience shows that when one can control the minds of others, one can also control the population as a whole. More control leads to more power to religious leaders of great intelligence, but total ignorance about people's individuality and their natural inventiveness. The majority of those leaders, as they have been known throughout the centuries, are forever hungry for more power and in need to collect more worshippers. While many are ever ready to sell shadows through their Sunday morning preaching, most of their congregations simply leave the thinking to someone else, allegedly more knowledgeable. Religious beliefs have further fostered superstitions, which were based upon man's passions and fears. Superstitious belief is always built upon blind faith and accepted without question. If such an important issue is questioned, it may be considered by the majority of religious groups as if it is questioning the spirit, which is apparently one of the gravest sins man can commit. This observation is the result of an in-depth study of man's past and evolution of man's religions over the centuries. History needs to remain pure and down to earth. It cannot and should not be interpreted in just one way, but must be studied with the data available and the historic artifacts man has left behind. Alas, those who attempted to describe what they have discovered were either persecuted or murdered in the name of an elusive deity who they were all prepared to die for or be sacrificed to. Man's religions and superstitions became intense diversions, hindering progressive thought. Man's evolution seems to be interrupted, as one can observe through their current trends, and worldwide conflicts based upon religious intolerance. Over the centuries, man has created many gods and eventually chose one who has apparently created them and rested on the seventh day of his creation. If you notice, he is still resting. Strangely, this great one continually interferes with man's evolution, stopping his undertakings as with the Tower of Babel, confusing their tongue as it was written in the past. Remember, he also destroyed those who were allegedly sinning against him through a worldwide flood. But did he not create sin for man to experience? God created man in his perfect image indeed. Consider, for example, the characteristics of nations. This is where we discover a familiar attribute, which is almost like asking someone to hit the other while claiming to be the one hit. Pushing and claiming to being pushed first. If you ponder upon this, you can see it is just like a child's game. The Holy Scriptures emphasize fear of God to the faithful and teach how jealous that God is. That God always presents very human attributes and is ever ready to punish and hurt his toys. No, this is not a sarcastic remark. Today, if you notice, man apparently worships the same God who created the nations and races under different names. But in reality, man still worships many gods under all kinds of disguises, and indeed, the worst-case scenario is that people are led to believe they are following the one and only God who created heaven and earth. Can it be nothing more than an illusion and grand myth? It is probably a diversion, so that man cannot see the bigger picture. There are also those who regard what is considered here as the workings of the devil, and forget that their devotional thoughts in this regard are equally ugly diversions, so that they cannot think for themselves. Some people prefer to hide behind the curtain of sins, for they have been led to absolute fear in thinking and being free, emphasizing the greatness of a devil and not the love of God. That may also be why Adam and Eve were hiding from God after their sinning. Strangely, it was also created by the same God for which the human world suffered, until this source of all greatness sacrificed his only begotten Son, so that everyone believing in him would have everlasting life. A beautiful story to keep man appeased, while he bends to the control of the leadership. But is this the reality, and who really is the Creator God? However, man is also very clever and capable of considering logic and common sense, for he can be extraordinarily logical and discover that he can no longer stagnate in the darkness of ignorance. His evolutionary processes have helped him to understand the workings of life around him better. Deep down he knows that the gods he worshipped throughout the centuries invented chaos and a vast variety of divisions. Man's creation of monotheism was commendable. However, this one God system has not been any different. In reality, man invented his gods. The God who a majority of humanity worships is a God who discriminates, separates, and punishes. Remember the words of that same greatness? My chosen. He must have created a reason, an excuse for that. The chosen were to teach and lead the world. They were to show the ways of that God, so that all can be like brothers unto each other. They were to lead the nations into one unity and one national identity on a worldwide scale. It sounds fantastic, does it not? But was it not that same God who created confusion by allowing the devil to rule over the world? Was he therefore not the perpetrator of rage, wars, and opposition of all kind? Perhaps man also created the devil, who was to lead people astray. But who was this devil in opposition to God? The Bible appears to contradict itself when one begins to make comparisons between the God of Old Testament and the New. This assumption leads us to conclude that the great God and the fallen ones were of the same source. Jealous, hateful, and unforgiving trends were indeed the characteristics of man's creation of God and the devil, reflecting his own passions. Those gods have introduced sin and punishment to the world, for man apparently needed those tools to lead others and control their every move. God, who allegedly created man, also introduced a grave sin to the world, and later decided to create a Christ identity to wipe off the sins of the world. In this way, Christianity was born. He even created a Holy Trinity, and God the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost were united as one. Man claimed Christ being God Almighty, everlasting Father, and God incarnate, but the Christian world has never known peace and unity, persecuting so-called sinners severely. Mankind never agreed with each other and created more divisions. Remember, knowledge is power, and power is control. Then, this same God created his last great prophet to promote peace in the world. But adherers have never known any peace either. They were, and still are, in opposition to each other. They have fought one another for centuries. God's original chosen, and all the others which followed them, indeed, followed that one God, and all turned against each other. We are no doubt living in a world of many gods, believing them to be the one God who created the heavens and earth. Since it was the accepted truth that the three individual personalities were combined into one singular persona of the Supreme God, as with the Holy Trinity, there was no problem in creating multiple gods in large numbers, united as if one. It is probably better to consider that God created the chaos in the world. Was it all but a gravely wrong interpretation of everything which led to the current human understanding of religious beliefs? Despite my understanding and research in regard to the human dilemma, I choose to remain neutral, respecting people for whatever they elect to believe. Let us also consider the possibilities that there exists something mankind has not yet discovered, but is feeling its presence. This may probably be due to not being ready in their evolutionary progress, and therefore inability to comprehend. During the boat trips, Tony and I had very interesting discussions. Unlike his all-knowing sister, as he put it, he respected others with their education, undertakings, and discoveries. I found one could talk to him about everything intellectual and based upon historic facts. That was indeed refreshing. I discovered that both father and teenage son were more relaxed and calmed as we continued to talk about worthwhile issues. One of the subjects I recall so clearly was about names and identities of people, reflecting their traditional and therefore historic backgrounds. I remember my uncle Gregory, Kirkor in Armenian, also known as Karabet, and my grandmother talking about Karaism at some length. As I understood, many of their associates had practiced it in the past. Much later I discovered that it belonged to an ancient Jewish sect originating in Persia in the 700s AD. In fact, they never accepted the rabbinical traditions and Talmudic authority. Instead, Karaists chose to believe in the literal interpretation of the scriptures. In the Hebrew language, they were known as Karaim. That, I believe, was the reason some of my ancestors adopted the word Kara in their name a long time ago as part of their traditions. I prefer to take this as a theory which may explain why the word was included in our family names, past and present, but it could also be coincidental. Kara is also a very common name used throughout Anatolia for centuries. Long before the First World War, some relatives were from a well-to-do background. Other relatives preferred to use the name Karabetyan, but during the war years, some of the information could have been altered or destroyed, particularly by members of the Ottoman Empire, due to their unending hatred towards infidel Armenians. The center of operations was where most of my distant relatives chose to live, probably France, but later the family was divided into several branches due to marriage, some settling in Greece, and others preferring to stay in western parts of Anatolia, where they had extensive properties when it belonged to Armenia. The ones settling in Anatolia experienced great losses and tragedies during the well-documented slaughter of Armenians in 1915. Fierce battles caused great trauma to both the Ottoman Turks and Armenians. Most of this information I will have to take with a pinch of salt, because unfortunately much of the genuine documentation has been destroyed. The Turks were helped by some other European nations to gain access into Russia an easier way. This created still further hatred towards Armenians, which became an ongoing tradition in that part of the world. Those who chose to stay in Turkey, for they had a historic and traditional connection with the land of their ancestors, disguised their identities or completely changed them in order to survive. Today many are still living in fear of being discovered belonging to the Armenian race, for they know that if discovered, they will be laughed at, endlessly criticized for having infidel names, or even killed. They all live on the edge because some have been wrongly and deliberately accused of illegal activities which allegedly are harmful to the country's stability in the political and religious sense, and have been shot. However, Armenians greatly contributed to the sciences and culture of the country. Although past relations altered their family name to Karabuyukyan in Turkey, it was due to the locals' inability to pronounce foreign names correctly. It may have been due to Armenians' traditional values of blending in and living a life like the locals in any given country. In the Turkic sense, it means son of the black mustache, which sounds like a pirate. According to our uncle and both grandmothers, our father's desire to live and die in Turkey was based upon his hope of regaining at least a portion of the family's former property there. He hoped that one day he could capture part of this ancient wealth, and I believe that some of our relatives are hopeful to do the same even now. However, I feel it is an impossible dream. When I lived with my parents, who felt obliged to stay in that country, I had no choice but attend their schools, while I was continually questioned by the teachers, friends, and other people as to why my parents' names were so unusually different, not sounding Turkish, although they spoke the local language just like native citizens. My father's friends did not identify him with his original name, but by Idris Bey, and my mother they preferred to call with a name which sounded Muslim, Shahin, or Shahende Hanım. Like my brother, I was forced to tell the same when asked, because constantly needing to explain the meaning behind those names became a real drudgery and headache. At least by altering our names, those endless question sessions were not furthered. It was as if we were in need to hide for our crime of being Armenian. When I was living in Turkey, and most certainly under duress, I could not wait until I tasted real freedom to be somebody and live freely in a more democratic system. My father, who was in reality one-track-minded, insisted that only after the conscripted military service of 2 years could I be considered a real man and mature. He also insisted that to become a genuine citizen of Turkey, one had to serve the country. It did not appeal to me to live the rest of my life in a place where I would remain forever an infidel and foreigner. It was a country where I had to answer everybody about my background and forever looked down on, never being given any opportunity to excel for being of Armenian origin, a country where I have constantly been told to go back to where I originated from. Even today, many journalists, performers, musicians, and other professional people of Armenian background live in absolute fear of being discovered. In almost all Middle Eastern countries, people of different ethnicities, different beliefs, cannot survive and be successful in their undertakings if they retain their original identities and do not camouflage their backgrounds. Without being too critical or promoting discrimination against them, this is the only way to survive. In France, however, many family friends like Arakelian, Garabetian, or Karapetian, or Aznavourians were happy French citizens, and happier still living far away from that once upon a time homeland. They made beautiful France their home for decades. In fact, Armenians are great travelers and explorers. They blend in with the societies of different ethnicities extremely well, and one would never know the difference between a native citizen of any country and an Armenian. It is said that next to a successful Jew, there can be found a successful Armenian, for both share a common goal, a good foundation in education. My ex-wife and her relatives and close associates comprising of Jehovah's Witnesses have never questioned why I applied for asylum in Germany. Surprisingly, they all prefer to consider me as Turkish. Even though I was married to a German citizen, their authorities suggested that I should go back to the country where I allegedly originated from. This made me feel completely unwanted anywhere, for I had the same experience when in Turkey. My marriage was unimportant to them, and they sent letters to my wife, as I have already detailed elsewhere in this story, warning her against being married to a Muslim who would not recognize the rights of his wife. That was the final straw, and my studying at one of their universities had no value as far as they were concerned. In Turkey, I was an Armenian dog, while in Germany I became a worthless and dirty Turk, as I was often called. I wondered how much of it has influenced my ex-wife and her family. Although I am certain she was knowledgeable about my background, my wife preferred to believe that I was as their authorities chose to consider me. However, I had traveled from Turkey to be free, not because of my disliking them, but because I had to. Did they at all care or consider why I left Turkey? Much later, my daughters, following the dictates of a completely unreasonable and unstable mind of someone who only followed the witnesses, chose exactly that identity to be mine, although their mother changed her marital name to something different, probably to the one whom she was in love with after our divorce, and due to her naivety. They continually questioned me about my supposed untruthfulness in regard to my undesirable name, which I had corrected. According to some gossip from their friends, I was apparently hiding from the public face, like a criminal. I honestly believe that, even after what I had tried for many years to explain what the real truth was in regard to my background, which had been totally ignored, I was considered as someone not worth taking note of or listening to, unless I strictly adhered to Jehovah's Witness teachings. Eventually, after speaking of the truth all these years ago, I was excommunicated. As far as they were concerned, I was nothing more than a liar, untrustworthy, even a criminally minded person, or simply insane, for not being a part of their holy organization. I was never a Jehovah's Witness, and therefore never a part of falsehood. I never followed the two-witness rule of justice, nor supported their ways of protecting sexual abuse or pedophilia within their congregations. One thing was certain: they were always right, even though they were often wrong, and I had to be always on the wrong side, even though I could be right. My second daughter is most certainly familiar with what she has been preaching all along. Mom always speaks the truth, and Dad tells many lies. One cannot trust him, and I know when Dad tells lies by looking at his eyes. Had she ever looked into my eyes to know all that? I heard the same from a number of people who knew her well. Were her friends false when telling me what Birgit was saying to them? Were those friends of hers only telling me lies? Was Magda not allowing her children to go house to house with witness elders without realizing she might have been sending them with child sex predators, since the wrongdoers are always protected from scrutiny? Alas, I had my daughter's custody when they were young, although several times they tried to harm me, but I had forgiven them. They told so many stories and made use of their mother's naive state of mind, strengthening her belief in how wicked I was. I suppose they were now following the teachings of the holy book they were encouraged to study. Or were they? With all their endless lies, my daughters were keenly inventing ways to paint me black, because they could not get what they wanted in the most unreasonable manner. It seemed that they made it their only resolve to destroy my reputation and life to please their own Lord and Master, who could not in reality be any other than the devil himself. On all sides and viewpoints, it seems they were, including their mother, members of a fanatical group of cultists, full of untruths. For after all, research points to the one and only direction that witnesses can accept, that is, to follow the imaginings of their founders, while thinking they are the only recipients of God's truth. Tony mentioned that there were a few Armenians he knew of living in the islands, and they were mostly in the music or jewelry business. He was fascinated with the American writer best known for plays and stories praising the common man's ability to live a full, happy life in a world of ugly reality. This was William Saroyan, of Armenian origin. According to information available, his very first book was The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze, 1934, and later he wrote The Time of Your Life, 1939, The Human Comedy, 1943, and his autobiography, Not Dying, 1963. I believe Tony had thoroughly enjoyed reading them when he was in his teens. Filipinos were very knowledgeable about American literary art. How strange it was that my mother had also introduced me to reading them when I was very young. I had never questioned the origins of the author, but was fascinated with his philosophy. They asked me what the actual meaning behind my name was, obliging me to explain its Sanskrit and Armenian background, just like I have done elsewhere within this literature. One of his Irish friends once told him that there was a word known as Soren. When further researching, I discovered that in the ancient tongue it meant hospitality due to the Lord in Ireland as well as Scotland. No wonder my Scottish and Irish friends have always pronounced my name correctly, while others chose to call me with different names instead, like George, for instance. But I never responded to them, much to their annoyance. He was also familiar with the Danish biochemist who invented the pH system. It explained the acidity levels of certain elements in chemistry. His name was Søren Sørensen. But I had no relationship with him and his name, although I admired his great work in the science of chemistry. However, my name is pronounced exactly like that in the original language. My surname contains historic reality, as it is part of my ancestral background, although it could have been Sorenian, or simply the son of Soren. The name Sorensen I am identified with means exactly that, and is far better than one which was altered to suit Ottoman standards. I cannot identify myself with Karabükyan, or Karabikjan, or Karabikyan, for it is a distant memory and completely foreign to me. In Turkey, they all insisted calling me with this, and it became a subject of discrimination. I was immediately recognized as being an Armenian dog, and always laughed at as if I was the figure of a nasty joke. My friends promptly advised me to change my name to a more Turkish-sounding name to avoid ridicule. Like my brother, whenever I attended school in that country, as I mentioned elsewhere, I always attempted to disguise or discreetly wipe off part of my name. In other words, I aimed to make my name sound like Karabıyık instead, which translates as black mustache. Although my brother, who currently resides in Turkey since his move from the United States and having married in Turkey, used that name due to the absolute need to camouflage his true identity in the guise of a proper and native citizen of the country to survive the harsh political climate. I am certain that he would not feel ashamed to use his real name in any non-Muslim countries elsewhere around the world, especially if he discovered the actual format of the intended name. Is it not sad that Armenians have to disguise themselves as if they have committed the greatest crime of the century, even to this day? Worse still is that they often feel embarrassed with their Turkish-sounding names when they are living in overseas countries, and many Armenians I have met in Europe, the South Americas, and Australia feel the same. Hannah More's words contain much-needed wisdom. Forgiveness is the economy of the heart. Forgiveness saves the expense of anger, the cost of hatred, the waste of spirits. However, neither Turks nor Armenians care about this wisdom when they express their feelings towards each other, similar to the Jewish attitude towards the Nazi era, although we cannot compare the Jewish with others. We also seem to discover this kind of behavior in different societies all around the world. As long as this is fostered further amongst humans, there can be no ideal advancement. The "I am better than you are, and I have got better things than you have" mentality has failed humanity